Oregon, Michigan State this weekend, Joe. Look, Michigan State coming off a really tough opponent in Ohio State this last week. When you look at this matchup between Oregon, who has had their struggles this season, how do you see this game going?
Yeah, we saw last week for the first half that Michigan State was putting up a little bit of a fight, and we were starting to see why I think Michigan State, like next year, is going to be competitive. They could be on that Nebraska Matt Rule trajectory of getting better in year 2 and everything working out. This team does have the capability to put up a fight against Oregon. It's the same conversation that we just had about Ohio State. This is your primer before your big game next week. How do you look? To put it as simply as possible, you're going up against a team that has some of the best sack production in the country with 15 team sacks. They turn the ball over a ton. They have 8 interceptions and 8 fumbles on this year. They've lost 5 of those. Mm-hmm. Do you dominate and kick the crap out of that team and move on to the next one and your big battle for the top of the Big Ten? That's what this all comes down to. I don't think this needs to be overly analyzed. I think that Oregon has been a little bit slow to get going. They can't be slow to get going against a team like Michigan State because they can run the football. If they are a little bit safer on turnovers, they can score in the red zone like we saw in the Ohio State game, and they will get after you, and they will get sacks going up against an offensive line that has been figuring out who is the correct unit to have out there and feel confident in. So this has to be a game where if you're Oregon, you, like we just said with Ohio State, you see a lesser opponent, you show up pissed off, you put them in the ground, you move on to next week. That's all it is.
Let me ask you a question about Oregon. I know that they've had injuries along their offensive line. They've been banged up there. Does it worry you that they have had inabilities to run the football at moments?
I think it does. I think coming in this game, it absolutely can, because the front 7 for Michigan State is their strong suit. Being able to establish the run, I think, is going to be, and it should be, the focus, because you need that run game momentum for the following week against Ohio State. If you can't run the ball against Ohio State, you are sure as shit going to lose that game.
Yeah, man. Look, I think that there's a lot to be desired in reference to Oregon. Now, Joe, during the offseason, I still stay where I'm at. If there's, like if I told you this during the offseason, if there's a team and I needed to form a team, let me rephrase that. Dan Lanning would be the first guy that I called. I think how he's building Oregon, what he's doing at Oregon is still a really, really good thing. They've been banged up. They need to get Evan Stewart moving a little bit more and going a little bit more. They got to find ways to get him the football. We've seen him in the SEC be very dynamic. I think this is the week that you got to try to find a way to get him the football. I think he's got 14 catches on the year. Joe, their inability to run the football, I understand that they've been banged up, does worry me some. Here's the thing, though, man. Michigan State, is so bad at moments offensively, Joe. They're not ready, okay? And I don't – like, for example, I think Boise State's a better team than them, right? Like,
they're better. Michigan State. Yes, yeah, I agree.
Boise State's a better team than Michigan State because they can run the football, and you went up against a defensive line where you had times, again, understand your O-line concerns and injuries and all that, where you couldn't line up and run the football. You're Oregon. And to your point here, Joe, Michigan State had moments last week where their front 7 would look really good against Ohio State. You got to give it to them. I mean, they have flashes and moments. When does this team for Oregon start getting clicking? Joe, I feel like they're lollygagging through the season to some extent.
A little bit. Well, and this kind of plays into, because we're going to continue to juxtapose Oregon and Ohio State. Oregon's had more tests to this point than Ohio State has. It's not saying very much, but it does kind of feel like Ohio State's been locked in. They have looked at these opportunities to build chemistry, to figure out who their playmakers are, all those things, and just kick the crap out of everyone that they've played. And Oregon hasn't. Oregon played around with Idaho. Oregon played around with Boise State, who they should have been significantly better than. And then they finally smoked Oregon State the way that we should have expected them to. And then UCLA was a hair close, and then they really separated at the end. Which version of Oregon is going to show up against Michigan State? And then more importantly, which version shows up against Ohio State is going to be a big, big storyline. And I'm hoping that they wake the hell up. I'm going to be pissed off if next week that Ohio State-Oregon game does not live up to our expectations and it ends up being a weak game.
I feel like Oregon is a team at the current moment that when I look at them and watch them play, that the potential isn't the reality on the field, right? Like, meaning I see flashes of a top 6 football team. You know, like outside the Boise State game, I mean, they've relatively been fantastic at stopping the run. I mean, like relatively very good at it. But the problem is, Joe, when they're facing somebody that has a pulse, like a player that has a pulse, Joe, that player has gotten off on them. Idaho, okay, Boise State, even Oregon State to a little extent.
Well, Idaho doesn't really have any like big time guys on that team.
But Joe, that defense was doing some things that I'm like, dude, you can't have that happen if you're Oregon. Like that's inexcusable.
Well, wait, so what you're talking, not to cut you off, but to what you're talking about of those flashes being shown, like there have been the defensive flashes and there's been the inconsistency, and like you see the run game flashes where they ran all over Oregon State. We know that they can do it. It's just they're not showing up and doing it. State.
By the way, just to throw this out there, also a very depleted UCLA team. As someone who watched and covered UCLA for 5 games already this year, Joe, they're 127th in the country in rush defense.
Yeah, UCLA stinks.
So if you're going to tell me we were in the bowl against one of the worst teams in the Power 4, you better. Because listen, the way that you didn't look more impressive than LSU did when they played UCLA. You didn't look better than Indiana did. Joe, think about it like this. Indiana's receivers had more separation on UCLA than what Oregon's could.
It's not good.
No, it's not. So Oregon fans think I hate him. By the way, to all the Oregon fans that are watching this video on replay, I picked you to beat Washington twice last year, and you really didn't come through for me. So I still believe in you when no one else did. But I am just saying, Joe, you want to brag about UCLA. Good on you. They're one of the worst teams in the country that you had the inability to push around. That's what I didn't.
Yeah. Big opportunities for a lot of these teams. Establish momentum. BetOnline remains your top spot for all of your live betting action and contests. NFL, college football, UFC, NHL are all in full swing. BetOnline is your #1 source for wagering news, odds, trends, and predictions with both desktop and mobile access at any time. Head to BetOnline today and use promo code BELIEVE. That's BLEAV for 50% off your first deposit. That is a 50% welcome bonus. BetOnline, where the game starts.